April 23, 1945. The war in Europe was dying, but it was taking its time. In a temporary American detention facility outside the German town of Wertheim, Captain Robert Mitchell stood in the doorway of a converted barn and looked at 6 faces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They were children. The oldest might have been 15. The youngest looked barely 10 years old. They wore oversized Wehrmacht uniforms that hung off their thin frames like costumes from a school play gone terribly wrong. Their faces were smudged with dirt and fear, their eyes holding that peculiar mixture of defiance and terror that Mitchell had seen in cornered animals. These weren't the hardened SS officers he had interrogated in previous weeks. These were boys who should have been worrying about mathematics homework and baseball games, not facing potential execution as enemy combatants. The 6 children had been captured 3 days earlier during the American advance through southern Germany. They had been found manning an anti-aircraft position, though none of them seemed to know how to properly operate the weapon. 2 had surrendered immediately, hands raised high above their heads. The others had tried to run but were too exhausted and malnourished to get far. No shots had been fired during their capture. They had simply collapsed in a field, too tired to continue their futile resistance. Now they sat on the floor of the barn, their backs against the wall, watching Mitchell with the wary attention of prisoners who had been told stories about American brutality. The oldest boy, who Mitchell would later learn was named Heinrich Weber, kept his chin raised in an attempt at military bearing. His hand occasionally moved to straighten a uniform that was beyond any hope of looking proper. Beside him, the youngest child, Peter Hoffman, had his knees drawn up to his chest, his small hands gripped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Captain Mitchell was 38 years old, a father of 3 children back in Colorado. His own son was 12. Looking at these German boys, he saw echoes of birthday parties and baseball games, of scraped knees and bedtime stories. The disconnect between what these children should have been and what they had become threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. He had orders sitting on his makeshift desk in the next room. The protocol for captured enemy combatants was clear, regardless of age. But something in Mitchell rebelled against the very idea of treating these exhausted children as hardened soldiers deserving of harsh interrogation or immediate processing for prisoner of war camps. Sergeant Maria Hoffman stood beside him, her translator's notebook clutched in her hands. She was German-American, had grown up speaking both languages in her Pennsylvania home, and Mitchell could see that she was struggling with her own emotions. Her jaw was clenched, and there were tears pooling in her eyes that she refused to let fall. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir," she said carefully, "they're just babies." Mitchell nodded slowly, his decision already forming. "I know," he replied. "Get Private Johnson. Tell him to bring food, real food. Whatever we have that might remind them they're children, not soldiers." The story of how 6 children ended up in Wehrmacht uniforms began months earlier, in the desperate winter of 1944. As Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the Nazi regime made increasingly desperate decisions. Among the most horrific was the expansion of the Volkssturm, the German national militia, to include boys as young as 10 years old. Heinrich Weber had been 14 when the recruitment officers came to his Berlin school. They didn't call it conscription. They called it an opportunity to defend the fatherland in its hour of greatest need. His teacher, Herr Braun, had stood at the front of the classroom with 2 SS officers and explained that every able-bodied German had a duty to resist the enemy invasion. Heinrich remembered how his classmates had looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and fear. They had grown up on stories of military glory, of heroic soldiers defending their homeland. The reality would prove far different from the propaganda. Klaus Richter, son of a Munich mechanic, had watched his father receive his conscription notice first. The older Richter had been drafted despite his age and poor health. 2 weeks later, 14-year-old Klaus received his own summons. His mother had wept openly, but there was no appealing such orders. To resist was to invite accusations of defeatism or cowardice, charges that could result in execution. The family had no choice but to comply. Dieter Schneider came from a farming family in Hamburg. At 13, he had been working his family's small plot of land when soldiers arrived in his village. They gathered all boys over the age of 12 and gave them a simple choice: volunteer for the Volkssturm or be conscripted. Either way, they were going. Dieter's father, who had lost an arm in the First World War, tried to argue that his son was needed for farm work. The soldiers ignored him. Germany needed soldiers more than it needed farmers, they said. The crops could wait. The war could not. Wolfgang Bauer had actually volunteered. At 12 years old, he had been a fervent member of the Hitler Youth, believing every word of the propaganda he had been taught since he was old enough to understand language. His parents in Dresden had been loyal Nazi Party members, and Wolfgang genuinely believed he was defending civilization against barbaric enemies. He would be the one to struggle most with the cognitive dissonance that would come later. Franz Keller had nowhere else to go. At 11 years old, he had survived the bombing of Cologne that killed both his parents. He had been living in a shelter for displaced children when the Volkssturm recruiters came through. They promised food, shelter, and purpose. For an orphaned child with no other options, even military service seemed better than starving in the ruins. Peter Hoffmann, the youngest at 10 years old, barely understood what was happening when soldiers took him from his Stuttgart neighborhood. His mother had been killed in an air raid. His father was missing, presumably dead on the Eastern Front. Peter became a soldier because there was simply no one left to protect him from becoming one. Captain Robert Mitchell sat alone in his temporary office, a converted storage room in the farmhouse adjacent to the barn. The orders from division headquarters lay on the desk before him, and he had read them 3 times, hoping each time that the words might somehow change. They did not. The directive was clear. All captured enemy combatants, regardless of age, were to be processed according to standard military protocol. Child soldiers were to be separated from adult prisoners, interrogated by intelligence officers, and held pending determination of their status under international law. The Geneva Convention provided some protections for prisoners of war, but its provisions regarding child combatants were ambiguous at best. More troubling was the addendum attached to the orders, marked confidential. It noted that several child soldiers captured in recent weeks had been affiliated with the werewolf resistance movement, a fanatical group pledged to continue fighting even after official German surrender. The memo recommended extreme caution when dealing with such prisoners. Some commanders had interpreted extreme caution as grounds for summary execution of suspected werewolf members, regardless of age. Mitchell knew that technically he could justify almost any action toward these 6 boys under the broad language of the orders. He could classify them as dangerous combatants. He could recommend their transfer to a high-security facility. He could wash his hands of the entire situation and let someone else make the difficult decisions. But every time he considered taking that path, he thought of his own children back in Colorado. His son Thomas was 12 years old, the same age as 2 of the boys in that barn. Could Thomas be held responsible for believing what his teachers and government told him? Could any child be fairly judged for actions taken under such circumstances? The door opened quietly, and Sergeant Maria Hoffmann entered. She had been crying, her eyes red and puffy, though she had composed herself now. In her hands, she carried a folder containing preliminary interviews with the boys, conducted through the barn door in gentle German. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind it, "none of them have any intelligence value. They don't know anything about troop movements or strategic plans. They were handed rifles and told to point them at tanks. That's the extent of their military training." She paused, then added more quietly, "The youngest one, Peter, asked me if we were going to shoot them. He said he was sorry for being a soldier. He said he just wanted to go home, but he doesn't have a home anymore." Mitchell felt something harden in his chest, a determination that pushed aside his uncertainty. He took the execution orders, the memos about werewolf resistance, and the protocols for processing enemy combatants, and placed them in his desk drawer. Then he looked at Sergeant Hoffman directly. Private James Johnson carried a tray of food across the muddy yard, separating the farmhouse from the barn. The April evening was cool, and steam rose from the bowls of chili he had prepared using supplies from the company mess. Beside the chili, he had placed generous portions of cornbread, still warm from the oven. It was simple food, the kind of meal his grandmother used to make back in Georgia, but it represented something more than mere sustenance. It represented a choice about how to treat the 6 children waiting in that barn. Johnson was 24 years old, an African-American soldier who had faced his own share of prejudice and hardship. He had grown up in the segregated South, had experienced firsthand what it meant to be judged and condemned for things beyond his control. When Captain Mitchell had told him about the child prisoners and asked him to be their primary guard, Johnson had understood immediately what the captain was really asking. He was being asked to see past their uniforms, past their nationality, past everything that marked them as enemy, and to treat them as what they truly were, frightened children far from home. As Johnson entered the barn, all 6 boys scrambled to their feet, their postures rigid with fear. They had clearly been expecting something very different from a meal. Heinrich, the oldest, positioned himself slightly in front of the others, a protective gesture that spoke of the responsibility he had assumed for his younger companions. His eyes darted from Johnson's face to the tray he carried, confusion replacing some of the fear. Johnson set the tray down on an overturned crate and stepped back, his hands visible and empty. He smiled, the warm, genuine smile his own nephews knew well. "It's okay," he said softly, even though he knew they probably couldn't understand his English. "It's just food. You must be hungry." He gestured toward the tray, then mimed eating, hoping the universal language of shared meals might transcend the barriers of war and language. The boys didn't move. They had been taught that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and death. This display of kindness made no sense within their understanding of how the world worked. Franz, the 11-year-old orphan, was the first to break ranks. His hunger overcame his fear, and he moved slowly toward the tray, his eyes never leaving Johnson's face, watching for any sign of threat or deception. Johnson nodded encouragingly and stepped back further, giving the boys space. Franz reached out tentatively and picked up a piece of cornbread. He sniffed it cautiously, then took a small bite. His eyes widened in surprise at the taste, so different from the sawdust bread and thin soup that had been their rations for months. He took another bite, larger this time, and suddenly all 6 boys were moving toward the food with the desperate hunger of children who had been starving for far too long. Johnson watched them eat, and something in his chest tightened with emotion. Heinrich Weber had appointed himself the leader of their small group, not through any official designation, but through the simple fact that he was the oldest and felt responsible for the younger boys. At 15 years old, he carried burdens that no child should have to bear. He had watched over them during the chaotic retreat through southern Germany, had shared his meager rations with Peter when the youngest boy was too weak to march, had made decisions that sometimes meant the difference between survival and capture by vengeful Soviet forces pushing from the east. Born in Berlin in 1929, Heinrich had memories of Germany before the war, before the constant bombing raids that turned his neighborhood into rubble. His father had been a postal worker, a quiet man who had never joined the Nazi Party but had kept his head down and his opinions to himself. That caution had not saved him. He had been drafted in 1943 and killed somewhere on the Eastern Front. Heinrich's mother and younger sister had died in a bombing raid in February of 1945. Heinrich had been away at his Volkssturm training camp when it happened. He learned of their deaths from a terse telegram that provided no details, no comfort, only the stark fact that he was now alone in the world. As the boys ate their cornbread and chili, Heinrich maintained his composure, eating slowly and deliberately, trying to model the dignity he believed soldiers should display even in captivity. But his hands shook slightly as he lifted the spoon to his mouth, betraying the fear he worked so hard to conceal. He kept glancing at Private Johnson, searching for signs of what might come after this unexpected kindness. In Heinrich's experience, nothing good came without a price. Peter Hoffman, at 10 years old, represented everything Heinrich was trying to protect. The youngest boy sat pressed against Klaus, seeking comfort in physical proximity to the older boys. Peter's uniform was comically oversized, the sleeves rolled up multiple times and still extending past his small hands. Someone had tried to alter the pants to fit him, but they still bunched around his ankles, making him look like a child playing dress-up rather than a soldier. Peter came from Stuttgart, where his father had worked in a factory producing parts for Messerschmitt aircraft. His mother had been a seamstress who sang while she worked, filling their small apartment with folk songs and lullabies. Both were gone now, casualties of a war that had consumed everything Peter knew and loved. He had nightmares every night, waking the other boys with his crying. Heinrich would hold him then, whispering reassurances he did not believe himself, promising that everything would be all right when he had no reason to think it would be. As Peter ate his chili, tears rolled down his cheeks, mixing with the food. He was crying, not from sadness in this moment, but from the overwhelming relief of being warm and fed and not immediately facing execution. It was Private Johnson who noticed first, moving closer with a handkerchief that he offered to the small boy. Peter took it with trembling fingers and whispered something in German that Johnson could not understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. "Thank you." The disconnect between what the boys had been taught about Americans and what they were experiencing created a cognitive dissonance that left them confused and unsettled. For years, they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda portraying Americans as barbaric criminals, a mongrel nation of gangsters and savages who would show no mercy to captured German soldiers. Nazi propaganda films had depicted American soldiers as brutal occupiers who tortured prisoners and committed atrocities against civilians. The boys had believed these stories completely because they had no reason to doubt what their teachers, their leaders, and their entire society had told them was true. Wolfgang Bauer struggled most visibly with this contradiction. At 12 years old, he had been the most ideologically committed of the group, a true believer in everything the Hitler Youth had taught him. He had memorized the speeches, learned the songs, and genuinely believed that Germany was fighting a defensive war against enemies who sought to destroy their entire way of life. His parents in Dresden had been fervent Nazi supporters, and Wolfgang had absorbed their worldview as completely as he had learned to read and write. Now, sitting in this barn with a full stomach for the first time in weeks, being guarded by an African-American soldier who smiled at him with genuine warmth, Wolfgang felt his entire understanding of reality beginning to crumble. The propaganda had taught him that people like Private Johnson were subhuman, inferior beings who threatened German racial purity. Yet here was this man treating him with more kindness than Wolfgang had received from his own commanders, who had sent children into battle with minimal training and less regard for their survival. Klaus Richter, the 14-year-old mechanic's son from Munich, was more pragmatic in his assessment. He had never fully believed the propaganda, had seen too much of the war's brutal reality to accept simplistic narratives about heroic German defenders and evil foreign invaders. But even Klaus had expected harsh treatment from American captors, the Geneva Convention was something discussed in theoretical terms, not something he had expected to experience in practice. Yet here they were, being fed warm food, treated with basic human dignity, and guarded by a soldier who seemed genuinely concerned for their welfare. Dieter Schneider, the 13-year-old farmer's boy, observed everything with quiet attention. He had learned early in life that survival often depended on understanding situations quickly and adapting to new circumstances. He watched Private Johnson carefully, noting the man's body language, his gentle manner, the way he had stepped back to give them space to eat without feeling threatened. Dieter had spent enough time around animals to recognize genuine kindness when he saw it. And what he saw in the American soldier's face was not the cruelty the propaganda had promised. Franz Keller, orphaned and hardened by loss, remained suspicious despite the food and warmth. At 11 years old, he had learned that the world was cruel and that kindness was often a prelude to betrayal. He ate the cornbread mechanically, tasting nothing, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. He had survived this long by trusting no one, and he was not ready to change that approach simply because one American soldier had brought them dinner. Private James Johnson had 3 nephews back in Georgia, boys he had helped raise while their father, his brother, worked long hours in the cotton mill. Marcus was 12, Samuel was 10, and little Isaiah was 8 years old. Johnson had taught them to fish in the creek behind their grandmother's house, had shown them how to throw a baseball, had told them stories on summer evenings while fireflies danced in the darkness. When he looked at the 6 German boys huddled in this barn, he saw Marcus in Heinrich's protective posture, Samuel in Peter's frightened eyes, and Isaiah in Franz's defensive suspicion. Growing up in the segregated South had taught Johnson about the arbitrary nature of hatred, about how people could be taught to see others as less than human, based on nothing more substantial than the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. He had experienced firsthand what it meant to be judged not for his character or actions, but for factors entirely beyond his control. These German boys had been born into a society that had poisoned their minds with lies, had been conscripted into a war they did not start, and were now facing consequences for decisions made by adults who had used them as cannon fodder in a losing cause. Johnson had volunteered for the Army in 1942, despite knowing that he would face discrimination even while serving his country. He had endured the indignity of segregated units, had been assigned to labor battalions instead of combat roles despite his qualifications, had watched white soldiers with less training receive promotions he was denied. Yet he had persevered because he believed, perhaps naively, that serving honorably might help change minds and hearts, might prove that a man's worth had nothing to do with the color of his skin. Now, assigned to guard these child prisoners, Johnson saw an opportunity to live out those beliefs in a concrete way. He could not change the racism he faced back home, could not single-handedly dismantle the Jim Crow laws that governed his daily life in Georgia, but he could choose how he treated 6 frightened children who needed someone to show them that the propaganda they had been taught was wrong, that enemies could become something other than enemies if given the chance. After the boys finished eating, Johnson collected the empty bowls but did not immediately leave. Instead, he sat down on the floor near the doorway, maintaining enough distance to avoid seeming threatening, but close enough to make his presence felt. He pulled out a small photograph from his wallet, one of his 3 nephews standing in front of their grandmother's house, all 3 grinning at the camera. He held it up so the boys could see, pointing first to the photograph and then to himself. "My nephews," he said clearly, knowing they would not understand the words but hoping they might understand the gesture. "Family." Heinrich studied the photograph with obvious interest, then looked at Johnson with new curiosity. The American soldier had people he cared about, children who mattered to him. This simple revelation humanized their captor in a way that no amount of kind treatment alone could have achieved. Sergeant Maria Hoffman had emigrated from Germany with her parents in 1923 when she was just 7 years old. Her family had settled in Pennsylvania, where her father found work in a steel mill and her mother took in sewing. Maria had grown up speaking German at home and English everywhere else, existing in the space between 2 cultures, 2 identities, 2 ways of seeing the world. She had become a translator for the Army because her skills were needed, but nothing in her training had prepared her for this. When Captain Mitchell asked her to conduct formal interviews with the 6 boys, Maria had agreed professionally, mechanically, treating it as just another assignment. But the moment she sat down across from Heinrich Weber and began asking him questions in German, something inside her broke. His accent was pure Berlin, the same dialect her grandmother had spoken. His mannerisms, the way he sat with rigid military posture while his eyes betrayed his terror, reminded her of cousins she had left behind when her family immigrated. Heinrich told her his story in halting sentences, his voice barely above a whisper. He described his mother and sister's deaths, his father's disappearance on the Eastern Front, his desperate attempts to keep the younger boys alive during the chaotic retreat. He spoke about being given a rifle he barely knew how to use and being told to stop American tanks. He described nights spent hiding in barns and abandoned buildings, sharing scraps of food, watching friends die from wounds or exposure, or simply giving up. Maria wrote down his answers in her official report, her handwriting growing increasingly unsteady as the interview continued. When Heinrich finished speaking, he looked at her directly and asked in German, "Will they execute us? Please, just tell me the truth. The younger ones, Peter and Franz, they're so scared. If we're going to die, I need to prepare them." That was when Maria Hoffman, professional Army translator and naturalized American citizen, began to cry. She tried to maintain her composure, but tears streamed down her face as she looked at this 15-year-old boy who was trying to figure out how to help younger children face their own deaths with dignity. She thought about her own nephew, safe in Pennsylvania, playing baseball and complaining about homework, living the childhood that Heinrich had been denied. She wanted to reassure him, to promise that everything would be all right, but she did not have the authority to make such promises. Instead, she told him the only truth she knew with certainty. "Captain Mitchell is a good man," she said in German. "He has children of your age. He will try to do what is right." It was not much, but it was something. Heinrich nodded slowly, accepting this small measure of hope because it was all he had. After completing all 6 interviews, Maria went directly to Captain Mitchell's office. She did not knock, simply entered and placed her reports on his desk. Then she looked him in the eyes and spoke with quiet intensity. "Sir, if we harm these children, we become everything the Nazis claimed we were." The nightmares began the first night and continued every night thereafter. Peter Hoffman would wake screaming, his small body trembling with remembered terror. Sometimes he called for his mother, the German words echoing in the dark barn. Other times he simply screamed wordlessly, lost in memories of artillery fire, of buildings collapsing, of the adults who were supposed to protect him, sending him toward enemy tanks with a rifle he could barely lift. Heinrich would wake immediately when Peter's screams started, moving to comfort the younger boy in the darkness. He had learned to recognize the signs of Peter's nightmares, the way his breathing would quicken moments before the screaming began. Heinrich would hold him, whispering reassurances in German, promising safety he had no power to guarantee. The other boys would wake too, disturbed by the screams but understanding. They all had their own nightmares. Wolfgang Bauer's nightmares were different. He dreamed of the things he had been taught to believe, the glorious future Germany was supposed to create, the heroic sacrifices that would lead to ultimate victory. In his dreams, these promises were real, and he woke to the crushing realization that they had all been lies. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical in its intensity, a sick feeling in his stomach that food could not ease. Klaus Richter rarely screamed in his sleep, but he woke often, his body rigid with tension. He dreamed of his father being marched away to his conscription, of his mother's tears, of the moment the recruitment officers came for him. In his nightmares, he tried to run, but his legs would not move. He tried to fight, but his arms would not respond. He could only stand frozen while adults made decisions that would determine whether he lived or died. Private Johnson, sleeping in a small room adjacent to the barn, heard Peter's screams on that first night and every night after. He would rise quietly and enter the barn, not to discipline or silence the children, but simply to be present. He understood trauma. He had his own nightmares about things he had seen during the war, about friends who had died in his arms, about the violence that had become routine. On the third night, when Peter's screaming woke everyone, Johnson brought warm milk that he had heated on the farmhouse stove. He did not speak, knowing his English would not comfort them, but he sat with them in the darkness, his presence a silent reassurance that they were not alone. Heinrich watched this quiet act of kindness and felt something shift inside him. This American soldier had no obligation to care about their nightmares, no reason to lose sleep over enemy children who had tried to kill his comrades. Yet here he was, night after night, offering what comfort he could. Dieter Schneider, ever observant, noticed how Johnson's own hands sometimes trembled, how his eyes held shadows that suggested his own battles with memory. The realization that their captor also suffered from wounds they could not see created an unexpected bond. Captain Mitchell made a decision in the second week of the boys' captivity that many of his fellow officers would have considered dangerously sentimental. He provided them with paper, pencils, and envelopes, and through Sergeant Hoffman's translation, he invited them to write letters to their families. He knew that most of these letters would never reach their intended recipients. Mail service in defeated Germany was virtually non-existent. Many of the addresses the boys provided led to cities that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns. But Mitchell understood that the act of writing itself had value, that putting words on paper could help these children process grief and trauma that they had no other way to express. He had written countless letters to his own children during the war, letters that helped him maintain connection to the life he hoped to return to someday. He wanted to give these German boys the same opportunity. Heinrich wrote to his sister, even though he knew she was dead. His letter described the American camp, the unexpected kindness they had encountered, and his hope that wherever she was at peace. He apologized for not being there when the bombs fell, for failing in his duty to protect her. He told her about Peter, how the young boy reminded him of her, and how he was trying to keep the younger boy safe the way he had failed to keep her safe. Klaus wrote to his father, addressing the letter to the last military unit he knew the older man had been assigned to. He described the mechanics of various American vehicles he had observed, knowing his father would appreciate such details. He wrote about the end of the war, wondering if his father was still alive, if they would ever see each other again. He did not mention his own fears or the nightmares that woke him. Dieter wrote to his farm, addressing the letter not to any person but to the land itself. He described missing the smell of soil and growing things, the rhythm of seasons that governed farm life. He wrote about wanting to plant seeds again, to see things grow instead of watching everything burn and collapse. His letter was poetry without meaning to be, filled with longing for a life that might never exist again. Wolfgang struggled most with his letter. He started writing to his parents, then stopped, unsure what to say to people who had filled his head with beliefs he was now questioning. He crumpled several attempts before finally writing a simple message describing where he was and asking if they had survived Dresden's destruction. His letter was formal, distant, the words of someone trying to maintain connection while recognizing that perhaps that connection had been built on foundations that could not support its weight. Captain Mitchell's transformation of the detention facility into an impromptu school began almost by accident. One afternoon in early May, he noticed Heinrich attempting to teach young Peter basic arithmetic using stones arranged in patterns on the barn floor. The older boy was patient despite Peter's struggles, explaining concepts in simple German that the 10-year-old could understand. Mitchell watched this scene for several minutes before making a decision that would define the remaining weeks of the boy's captivity. The next morning, Mitchell arrived at the barn with an armload of materials, primers in both English and German that Sergeant Hoffman had located from military education supplies, paper and pencils, several textbooks salvaged from a bombed school, and a worn baseball that had traveled with him from Colorado. Through Hoffman's translation, he announced that mornings would now be dedicated to lessons. If they were going to remain in American custody for any length of time, they needed to learn English. More importantly, they needed to remember they were children, not just soldiers. Private Johnson became the unlikely teacher of baseball, using the game to teach English vocabulary and American culture simultaneously. He demonstrated how to hold the bat, how to throw and catch, using simple English words repeated until the boys began to understand. "Catch," he would say, tossing the ball gently to Heinrich. "Throw," he would instruct, gesturing for the boy to return it. The game provided structure and normalcy, a reminder that childhood could involve play rather than just survival. Wolfgang struggled initially with accepting these lessons. Learning English felt like betrayal of his German identity, as if by adopting the enemy's language, he was abandoning everything he had been taught to defend. He sat apart during the first several sessions, his arms crossed, his face set in stubborn refusal. But gradually, he began to listen, despite himself. He noticed how Heinrich was picking up vocabulary quickly, how even young Peter was learning to recognize basic words. His natural competitiveness eventually overcame his ideological resistance. Sergeant Hoffman led the more formal academic instruction, teaching grammar and pronunciation with patience that surprised even herself. She had initially approached the assignment with professional detachment, but watching these boys struggle to master irregular verbs and confusing idioms awakened something maternal in her nature. She found herself staying beyond her required hours, bringing picture books that made vocabulary lessons more engaging, creating simple games that made learning feel less like work. Dieter proved to have an exceptional aptitude for languages, his farm boy practicality translating well to the logical patterns of English grammar. He would practice pronunciation quietly to himself during evening hours, moving his mouth around unfamiliar sounds until they felt natural. Klaus approached English the way he approached mechanics, taking it apart systematically to understand how the pieces fit together. Franz remained suspicious of the entire enterprise, but participated because refusing would mean isolation from the group. The afternoons were dedicated to arithmetic, geography, and history, though Captain Mitchell carefully avoided topics directly related to the war. Instead, Hoffman taught them about American geography, describing vast distances and different climates, painting pictures of places so unlike bombed German cities that they seemed almost fantastical. She showed them where Colorado was on a map, where Georgia stretched across the south, helping them understand the diverse country that had become their temporary home. 3 weeks into their captivity, Captain Mitchell made the most difficult decision of his military career. He knew that eventually the boys would need to confront the full truth about what their country had done. They could not move forward in any meaningful way while still believing Nazi propaganda about Germany's noble cause and defensive war. He consulted with Sergeant Hoffman extensively, and together they planned how to present information that would shatter everything these children believed about their own identity. The morning started normally with English lessons and baseball practice. But after lunch, Mitchell gathered all 6 boys in the barn, along with Hoffman and Private Johnson. He had brought newspapers and photographs, materials that documented the liberation of concentration camps across Germany and Poland. The images were carefully selected, horrific enough to convey truth, but not so graphic as to traumatize children unnecessarily. Even so, what he was about to show them would change them forever. Sergeant Hoffman began speaking in German, her voice gentle but firm. She explained that they needed to understand something important about the war, about the government they had served. She told them that American and British forces had discovered camps where millions of people had been imprisoned, starved, and murdered systematically. She showed them photographs of Bergen-Belsen, of Dachau, of Buchenwald. She read accounts from American soldiers who had liberated these places, descriptions written by men who struggled to find words adequate to the horror they had witnessed. The boys' initial reaction was denial. Wolfgang was the first to speak, his voice rising in protest. "That's propaganda. American lies to make us look evil." He looked to Heinrich for support, but the older boy was staring at the photographs with growing horror. Heinrich had heard whispers during his time in the Volkssturm, rumors about special camps and disappeared people, but he had dismissed them as exaggerations or wartime paranoia. Now, looking at photographic evidence, at images that could not be propaganda because they showed American soldiers standing among the victims, he felt his entire understanding of reality crumbling. Klaus Richter began crying silently, tears streaming down his face as he looked at photographs of children not much younger than himself, starved to skeletal proportions. His father had always maintained a careful distance from Nazi ideology, had done his duty without enthusiasm. Klaus now understood why his father had been so careful, why certain topics had never been discussed in their home. His father had known, or at least suspected, and had protected his son through silence. Young Peter did not fully understand what he was seeing, but he understood that something terrible had happened, something that made even the adults in the room look sick. He moved closer to Heinrich, seeking comfort from the older boy who seemed to be falling apart before his eyes. Dieter sat very still, his farm boy pragmatism struggling to process information that contradicted everything about honor and duty he had been taught. Franz, the orphan who trusted nothing and no one, looked at the photographs with an expression that was almost vindicated. Food became the unexpected bridge between worlds that should have remained forever separated by war and hatred. Captain Mitchell understood instinctively what military strategists often overlooked, that breaking bread together was one of humanity's oldest rituals of peacemaking, a gesture that transcended language and ideology. In the days following the devastating revelation about concentration camps, when the boys were struggling with grief and shame and confusion, Mitchell made sure that mealtimes became occasions for connection rather than just sustenance. Private Johnson took to cooking meals that reminded him of home, recipes his grandmother had taught him during childhood summers in Georgia. He made cornbread with honey butter, thick stews with vegetables, fried chicken on Sundays when supplies permitted. He involved the boys in food preparation, teaching them to measure ingredients, to knead dough, to understand cooking as an act of care rather than just necessity. Wolfgang learned to make biscuits under Johnson's patient instruction, his hands working the dough with the same intensity he had once devoted to Hitler Youth drills. Klaus discovered he had an aptitude for cooking that surprised everyone, including himself. His mechanical mind translated well to following recipes, and he found satisfaction in creating something that brought obvious pleasure to others. He began experimenting with combining American ingredients with German techniques he remembered from his mother's kitchen, creating hybrid dishes that represented his own confused identity, neither fully German nor fully American, but something new. Sergeant Hoffman brought traditional German recipes to share, creating a sense of cultural continuity that the boys desperately needed. She made spätzle and sauerbraten, foods that tasted like home and memory. But she also made sure to frame these meals as gifts from her German heritage to her American comrades, demonstrating that cultural identity could coexist with national loyalty, that being German did not require being a Nazi. Dieter, the farm boy, educated everyone about where food came from, describing planting and harvesting cycles, teaching urban boys about the connection between land and table. He talked about wanting to grow food again, to participate in creation rather than destruction. Captain Mitchell listened carefully to these aspirations and began considering possibilities he had not previously contemplated. Mealtimes evolved into the most important part of each day, occasions when guards and prisoners sat together, when language barriers mattered less than shared appreciation for well-prepared food. Private Johnson taught the boys to say grace before meals, not as religious indoctrination, but as a moment of gratitude and reflection. Heinrich struggled with the concept initially, questioning what they had to be grateful for, but gradually he came to understand that gratitude was not about denying pain, but about recognizing moments of goodness, even in terrible circumstances. Young Peter began to smile during meals, his face lighting up when presented with dishes he particularly enjoyed. His nightmares became less frequent, as if the daily ritual of shared meals provided enough security to ease his sleeping mind. Franz remained somewhat guarded but accepted second helpings readily, his survival instinct recognizing that reliable food meant these Americans genuinely intended to keep them alive and healthy. Major General Thomas Hartwell arrived at the facility on a gray morning in late May, his staff car kicking up dust as it pulled into the farmyard. He was 52 years old, a career officer who had served in the First World War and had seen enough of combat to have strong opinions about military discipline and proper procedure. He had received reports about Captain Mitchell's unconventional handling of the child prisoners, and he had come to investigate personally. Captain Mitchell met him at the farmhouse, standing at attention with proper military bearing, despite knowing that his decisions would likely be questioned. General Hartwell returned his salute with precision, then fixed him with a look that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Captain, I understand you have 6 German prisoners who should have been processed for transfer weeks ago. I'd like to see them immediately." As they walked toward the barn, Mitchell explained his reasoning as concisely as possible. He described the boys' ages, their circumstances, the lack of any intelligence value, and his belief that standard prisoner processing would be fundamentally unjust in this case. Hartwell listened without interrupting, his face impassive. When they entered the barn, the 6 boys immediately stood at attention, their posture reflecting Heinrich's insistence on maintaining discipline even in captivity. What General Hartwell observed was not what he had expected. The boys were clean, healthy, and obviously well-fed. They wore patched but serviceable clothing rather than their Wehrmacht uniforms. A makeshift classroom occupied one corner of the barn, with English primers stacked neatly on a table. A baseball sat in another corner alongside improvised bases made from flattened cardboard. The scene looked more like a peculiar boarding school than a prisoner detention facility. Hartwell requested that Sergeant Hoffman translate as he questioned the boys directly. He asked Heinrich about his treatment, about whether he had been coerced or mistreated. Heinrich answered honestly, describing the kindness they had received, the education being provided, and his confusion about why Americans were treating them this way. When Hartwell asked what Heinrich wanted, the 15-year-old boy gave an answer that clearly surprised the general. "Sir, I do not know what I want," Heinrich said carefully in halting English, wanting the general to understand him directly. "But I know I cannot go back to Germany believing what I believed before. Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Hoffman showed us truth, difficult truth. Now I must decide what to do with this knowledge." Hartwell then spoke with Private Johnson, questioning his role and motivation. Johnson explained simply that these boys reminded him of his nephews, that he could not treat children as dangerous enemies, regardless of their nationality. He spoke about believing in America's values, about proving through actions that Americans were better than Nazi propaganda claimed. After 2 hours of inspection and interviews, General Hartwell requested a private meeting with Captain Mitchell. In the farmhouse office, he sat heavily in a chair and was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Captain, you have created a situation that has no precedent in military regulations. You should have processed these prisoners according to standard protocol. You violated procedure, ignored orders, and made decisions above your authority." He paused, and Mitchell prepared for disciplinary action. The question of what would happen to the boys could no longer be postponed. General Hartwell's visit had resulted in unexpected support for Captain Mitchell's approach, but it had also forced a timeline for decision-making. Germany had officially surrendered, the war in Europe was over, and prisoners were being repatriated systematically. The 6 boys would need to either return to Germany or find some alternative arrangement. and that decision needed to be made soon. Captain Mitchell gathered them in the barn on a warm June morning to present their options. Through Sergeant Hoffman's translation, he explained that they could be repatriated to Germany, processed through displaced persons camps, and eventually released to whatever remained of their families or communities. Alternatively, if American sponsors could be found, they might be allowed to remain in the United States under a special immigration status that General Hartwell had helped arrange. The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Each boy was confronting a choice that would define the rest of his life, a decision no child should have to make. Return to a defeated, devastated homeland where they might find nothing and no one, or stay in the country that had been their enemy, abandoning their language, culture, and identity to become something entirely new. Heinrich was torn by competing responsibilities. Part of him believed his duty lay in returning to Germany, helping rebuild the country from its ruins. But what could a 15-year-old boy accomplish in a land where cities were rubble and moral authority had been completely destroyed? Here in America, he had education opportunities, a chance to become something more than just another displaced person struggling for survival. Yet choosing to stay felt like abandonment, like turning his back on everyone who had suffered. Wolfgang faced perhaps the most difficult internal struggle. His entire identity had been constructed around being German, around serving the fatherland, but that Germany no longer existed, and the values he had been taught to uphold had been revealed as monstrous lies. Could he remain loyal to a country that had so completely betrayed everything he thought it represented? Or would staying in America be an admission that everything about his childhood had been built on foundations of sand? Klaus approached the decision pragmatically. His father was likely dead, his mother's fate unknown. Their apartment in Munich had probably been destroyed. In Germany, he would be another orphaned teenager with no prospects and limited skills. In America, he had discovered an aptitude for cooking and mechanics. Captain Mitchell had already discussed possibilities of apprenticeships if Klaus chose to stay. The practical choice seemed obvious, even if the emotional weight was crushing. Dieter thought about his family's farm, wondering if anything remained of the land his family had worked for generations. Could he really abandon that connection to soil and place? But he also remembered American geography lessons, learning about vast farmlands in places like Iowa and Kansas. Perhaps he could farm in America, reconnect with the earth in a place where that earth had not been soaked with blood. Franz, the orphan, had the least to return to, and therefore the clearest decision. The response from the local American community exceeded everyone's expectations. When word spread that the 6 German boys needed sponsors, families began coming forward with offers that reflected both generosity and genuine compassion. Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher who had befriended Sergeant Hoffman, was among the first to volunteer. She and her husband had 2 grown daughters and an empty house that felt too quiet. They offered to sponsor Heinrich, providing him with room, board, and support while he continued his education. Private Johnson's sister in Georgia wrote a letter offering to take in young Peter. She had 4 children of her own and believed that being part of a large, active family would help the traumatized 10-year-old find healing. Her husband worked for the railroad and could provide stable employment when Peter was old enough. Johnson was deeply moved by his sister's offer, recognizing it as an extension of the values their grandmother had instilled in them about caring for those who had no one else. A local farmer named Edward Morrison, no relation to Private James Morrison, came forward to sponsor Dieter. Morrison was getting older and needed help on his dairy farm. He had heard about the German boy who missed farming, who talked about wanting to work with land and animals again. He offered Dieter not just sponsorship, but apprenticeship, a chance to learn American farming techniques while maintaining connection to the agricultural life he had known. A mechanic in Worcester offered to take Klaus as an apprentice, providing both sponsorship and career training. The man had lost his own son in the Pacific Theater and spoke honestly about how teaching Klaus would help fill a void in his life. He made clear that he was not trying to replace his son, but that channeling his grief into helping a young person build a future seemed more constructive than drowning in bitterness. Wolfgang's situation was more complicated. His fervent Nazi ideology had been most thoroughly shattered by the revelation of concentration camps, leaving him without clear identity or purpose. A local minister and his wife, who had experience working with troubled youth, offered to sponsor him. They believed that Wolfgang needed spiritual and psychological guidance as much as he needed material support, and they were willing to provide patient, long-term care as he reconstructed his understanding of morality and purpose. Franz, suspicious and guarded, was offered sponsorship by Dr. Robert Hayes, the camp's medical officer. Hayes had observed Franz's intelligence and defensive resilience and believed the boy had potential if given proper guidance. He offered to provide education and eventual training in medical fields, seeing in Franz someone who could channel survival instincts into healing professions. Captain Mitchell facilitated meetings between the boys and their potential sponsors, making sure each child understood what was being offered and felt comfortable with the arrangement. These were not adoptions in the legal sense, but something more complex, relationships that acknowledged the boys' German heritage while offering them American futures. The sponsors were remarkably thoughtful about this complexity, recognizing that asking the boys to completely abandon their cultural identity would be both impossible and wrong. The transition from prisoners to immigrants happened gradually over the summer of 1945. Each boy moved to his sponsor's home, beginning the difficult process of building new lives in a country that had been their enemy just months before. The adjustment was neither smooth nor simple, but it was marked by small victories that accumulated into something resembling belonging. Heinrich moved into the Henderson home in late June. Mrs. Henderson enrolled him in the local high school for the fall semester, and he spent the summer preparing academically while working part-time at her husband's hardware store. His English improved rapidly, losing its heavy accent through constant practice. But he struggled with identity questions that kept him awake at night. Who was he now? Still German? Becoming American? Something undefined in between? Peter's integration into the Johnson family in Georgia proved easier than anyone expected. Surrounded by cousins close to his age, immersed in the chaos of a large, loving family, the 10-year-old began to heal. His nightmares decreased in frequency. He started smiling more readily. His aunt wrote to Private Johnson describing how Peter had laughed for the first time while playing in the creek, a sound she described as proof that childhood could survive even terrible trauma. Dieter thrived on the Morrison farm, rising before dawn to help with milking, learning the rhythms of American agriculture. He discovered that farming was fundamentally similar, regardless of country, that cows needed care and crops needed attention, whether the soil was in Germany or Massachusetts. The physical work provided structure and purpose, and Morrison's patient teaching style helped Dieter understand that he could honor his German farming heritage while building an American farming future. Klaus's mechanical aptitude flourished under his sponsor's guidance. The Worcester mechanic taught him to work on cars and trucks, skills that would serve Klaus well throughout his life. More importantly, the man shared stories about his deceased son without making Klaus feel he was expected to fill that void. They developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than attempted replacement. Wolfgang's journey was hardest. The minister and his wife provided counseling alongside material support, helping him work through the cognitive dissonance of discovering that everything he had believed was false. Wolfgang attended church services where messages about redemption and forgiveness resonated painfully. He wrote long letters to Heinrich, working through philosophical questions about guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of becoming someone different from who you were raised to be. Franz remained guarded, despite Dr. Hayes's patience. The 11-year-old had been betrayed too many times to trust easily. But Hayes did not push for emotional breakthroughs, instead focusing on education and routine. He taught Franz basic first aid, let him observe medical procedures, and gradually Franz began to see healing professions as worthy of his intelligence and attention. By autumn, all 6 boys were enrolled in American schools. They faced questions, curiosity, and occasional hostility from classmates who had lost fathers and brothers to German soldiers. But they also found unexpected acceptance from young people who saw them simply as new students rather than former enemies. September 7, 2005. The farmhouse outside Wertheim still stood, though it had been converted into a small museum dedicated to unusual prisoner-of-war stories. 6 elderly men gathered in front of the building where their lives had changed 60 years earlier. They had traveled from across America, bringing children and grandchildren to see the place where American soldiers had chosen compassion over protocol. Heinrich Weber, now Henry Henderson, was 80 years old. He had become a professor of German literature, teaching at the same college where Mrs. Henderson had once taught. He had married, raised 3 children, and never forgotten the afternoon when Captain Mitchell brought cornbread instead of execution orders. His grandchildren listened as he described being 15 years old and believing his life was over. Peter Johnson, who had taken his sponsor's surname, stood with his arm around his American wife. At 70 years old, he was a retired railroad engineer with 5 children who had never known hunger or war. He spoke about nightmares that had lasted years but eventually faded, about learning to trust that adults could protect rather than exploit children. Dieter Morrison owned a successful dairy farm in Vermont. His children had continued farming, creating 3 generations of American farmers from German agricultural heritage. He placed his weathered farmer's hands on the barn door and remembered being 13 and thinking he would never touch soil again. Klaus Richter had become a successful automotive engineer, designing systems for American car manufacturers. His technical mind, which had approached English like a mechanical problem, had found its calling in making vehicles safer and more efficient. He brought blueprints for a safety innovation he had recently patented, wanting to show what that 15-year-old mechanic's son had eventually created. Wolfgang Bauer, who had struggled most with ideological transformation, had become a minister himself. He spent his career working with troubled youth, helping young people who had been taught hatred learn to embrace something better. His sermons about redemption came from lived experience, and his grandchildren knew him as the gentlest man they had ever met. Franz Hayes practiced emergency medicine for 40 years, channeling his survival instincts into saving lives. The suspicious 11-year-old orphan had become someone who ran toward danger to help others. His daughter, also a doctor, stood beside him as he described how Dr. Hayes had shown him that healing was stronger than hurting. They toured the small museum together, looking at photographs of their younger selves, at copies of the letters they had written, at documentation of Captain Mitchell's controversial decisions. Their families listened to stories that seemed almost impossible, about a moment in history when enemies became something else through the simple act of sharing cornbread and choosing mercy over vengeance. The reunion demonstrated that those 6 frightened boys had become 6 successful men who had contributed to their adopted country while never forgetting their German origins.